Welcome to Thrive in Design, a podcast about making money and beautiful interiors as it relates to product-based businesses in the interior design industry. Each week, we'll discuss innovative strategies on how to approach product development and design sales in a shifting market. I'm your host, Nicole Lachey Ben. Welcome back to another exciting episode of the Thrive in Design podcast. I'm your host, Nicole, and today I'm honored to welcome a very special guest, Jessica Bantom, a trailblazing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging practitioner, interior design consultant, and speaker. Jessica's mission is to help designers increase their cultural competence, empowering them to create spaces that truly honor humanity. As a global leader of equity, diversity, and belonging for DLR Group, she's an engaged advocate dedicated to advancing DEIB within the design industry. Jessica is also the author of Design for Identity, How to Design Authentically for a Diverse World, where she explores actionable ways to create meaningful outcomes for historically excluded communities. In today's episode, we'll dive into how design can be a force for equity and inclusion. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Jessica.
Thanks, Nicole. I'm glad to be here.
So this is a very important conversation that I'm excited to have today. It's so crucial for every industry, especially the design industry. If you're creating spaces, if you're creating products, if you're creating things, this conversation is going to be so important. And especially as we see this landscape ever changing, right? We saw it heightened when George Floyd was murdered at the start of the pandemic. We've seen companies implement DEI policies. We've also seen them rolling them back. So, Jessica, I'm excited to talk to you and get all the gems so that people can walk away from this conversation having actionable insights on what they could do right now, today. So start by telling us about your journey in the design world and what inspired you to focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging.
Yeah, so it's been an interesting path, I will say. I have an interior design background, but I've also been doing that in parallel with a career in IT and management consulting. But on the design side, I actually have an unrelated undergrad degree. I got out in the real world and started working for a few years and realized I should have actually gone ahead and pursued the design degree. So I actually went back, got my master's in interior design. And I've been working independently, doing that primarily with residential customers, but also with some commercial work in there too, since about 2006. And in parallel with that, as I mentioned, I have a background in IT and management consulting, which I've been doing since 2000. So I, went specialize in a couple different areas. But when I got into management consulting, I really started looking more at strategic communications and change management, and ultimately made a pivot to DEI in 2019. And it was at that point when I started having conversations around identity and difference and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging on a day-to-day basis that it really made me start thinking about the practice of design differently. I'd always been aware of my identity in the spaces that I was in as a designer, being either one of very few or the only who looked like me in a lot of spaces. But it took on a different meaning when I was actually helping organizations kind of reevaluate how they were showing up for each other and to really think about what those implications are in different industries, but specifically within design, because ultimately we design for everybody. And I was just questioning, how can there be so little diversity in a field where we literally design for everybody? So that really got me thinking about, what we don't learn in our design education, what practices we do not learn in the actual real world interaction with clients, to really explore cultural identity, and then to really think about how we translate what we hear into something that authentically represents who people are.
Yeah, and that's so important. Like literally, we are designing for everyone, every built environment, every type of person is occupying that space or using a product, and the diversity doesn't reflect who we're designing for, which even has me thinking about statistics that usually come out on every year. One specific statistic that I paid attention to this year was the percentage of Black interior designers in America, and it was like less than 2%. So yeah, just to put a number to that of how few Black women or Black designers overall are in the field, and then compared to the masses that we're designing for. So, as a DEIB consultant, what does your work entail and how does it really interact? I guess break that down a little bit more. You just touched on it a bit, but tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I have experience as a DEI leader for two organizations at this point. So helping them to articulate their strategies around DEI, what they want to achieve, what their objectives are that they're working towards, and then creating an actionable plan to kind of move toward that. And I also have experience doing DEIB culture assessments for organizations. So in addition to being a DEI leader, I have also been a DEI consultant. So I've been able to provide a couple different services in different capacities. But doing a culture assessment is basically just going into an organization and really just trying to assess where they are in terms of policies, practices, behaviors, and the culture that they've created and how that is impacting the people who are there, their workforce, and essentially just trying to identify what areas could use improvement, what areas could use more focus, and to help them to really get a plan in place to address those. And then I've done some work too, providing workshops on various topics, including things like unconscious bias, microaggressions, how to handle microaggressions, things like that. And then more recently, I've been pivoting to more speaking around this intersection of DEI and design.
Yeah. And I want to take a moment to also pause too, because we're also witnessing a lot of companies that were like gung ho about DEI also rolling back. When we're recording this episode, we actually saw the news break out of Walmart rolling their DEI initiatives back. So for the companies that are out there thinking about rolling their initiatives back, or maybe even starting to even consider DEI in their design practices or for the culture of their company, why is it important to keep it as a focus? And I even want to take it further because a lot of my audience are from interior product brands, right? And so they're manufacturing products. All they're focused on is beautiful products and getting the sale. So they always like, oh, we're just focusing on our bottom line, our ROI. So give us just a little bit about like why this is important right now and why it should stay at the center of what people are doing, both for their workplace culture and for their design processes.
Yeah, there are so many reasons why. For one thing, any business should be very deliberate about whether and how they address this. And I say whether because some organizations may not be at a place yet where they can fully, process all that this means. So for one thing, I will say, just to your point, a lot of organizations were very reactive in the summer of 2020. There was this racial awakening that was happening. And I think a lot of organizations kind of just jumped on the bandwagon, quite honestly. They started putting in pledges, these statements, all these things they were going to do to advance equity. And there was nothing wrong with saying it, but saying it without having a plan to actually address it is a whole other thing.
Right. Actions
And I think definitely. And I think a couple things happened in doing that. I think for one thing, a lot of business leaders didn't understand what they were committing to. And I say this now because even when I introduce myself to people and tell them what I do, they still don't know what I do. I mean, I work with some people day in, day out, and I know they're still wondering, but all day, what are you really doing? So there's a lack of understanding, number one. So, I don't think leaders even knew how to gauge whether this is quote unquote working, or they didn't even know what progress would look like. So when it came around that, we were starting to hear the bashing of DEI, that gave anyone who was either not committed, didn't fully understand, or hesitant an excuse to take their foot off the gas. And that didn't mean that, however, that it was right. Now, I have a marketing background. We talk about our similar background in that way. So even purely from a marketing and branding standpoint, those organizations need to understand the statement that they made even by backing away. And I think what also happens too here is that, like most people, most leaders tend to surround themselves with people like them.
Yeah.
So if you were not personally impacted and you didn't necessarily have a full appreciation for why this was important in the first place, then it probably wasn't a big deal to back off of it. However, the people who were really looking for this to really mean something and who were looking for real outcomes have been tracking who has been saying and doing what, because our outcomes rely on those organizations actually keeping their word. So what one leader may see is like, it's going back the other way. It's not a big deal. They have to understand that the people that they had maybe even started making some headway with in terms of really connecting, that they just lost them. They just completely lost their trust. And that's one thing that especially people of historically excluded backgrounds are ultra sensitive to, as we should be and have to be. But there's also another dimension to this too, because the younger generations are also very big about accountability. Yeah. And they are also very much driven by their values. So they are going to make decisions about who they work for, what products they buy, what brands they support. And they're looking for that accountability. So if you made the pledge, they want to see more than a page on your website. They want to see more than you have employee resource groups or a DEI leader. They want to see the proof that you're actually doing something. And when they don't see that, and then they go to your competitor and they have proof, stories, narratives, testimonials, all these things to point to, guess who they're going to go to? Those are just a couple factors that I don't think leaders are thinking about. Even when I got into my current position, one of the first things I did was to educate the executive leadership team on what I do.
Yeah.
And that's not, is in no way meaning to like demean them, to be dismissive, but it was because they had not worked in an organization with a DEI leader before. So like I said, I had that background of people being like, I don't know what this looks like. I don't know what progress looks like. And I'm like, well, let me help paint that picture. And then also in this vein of backing off and what that means, I just had to make it clear, you've already put that flag in the ground. Mm-hmm. So just understand, you've made a statement, even when you posted the job position for me, for the role that I'm in now, you made a statement, you've made many commitments even prior to that. So the people that you are looking to include or that you say you are looking to include, they're watching. Mm-hmm. And they're waiting and they're looking to see if your actions actually meet up with your words.
Yeah. And so let's talk about action.
Yes.
What are some of the key actions or processes that organizations need to take to integrate DEIB?
Well, I think there are a couple things. I think it is more comprehensive than just having a trainer come in and talk about microaggressions or unconscious bias, or to come in and give, which is very good context, but like the history of racial equity in our country or, things like that. I think that information is valuable. However, it is not going to move the needle the way you think it will, unless there is, number one, it's delivered well. So it's delivered in a way that people feel safe to have challenging conversations, that learning is also framed in a way that people have space to process and to learn and feel vulnerable and kind of have their own kind of aha moments. But then also that is then followed up with, okay, you've learned the concepts. Now let's talk about what that looks like in action. And that was another thing that happened post 2020. It was like, oh, everybody was getting work as a trainer. Like everybody come in, we need 1 million workshops.
Right.
And then what?
Right.
What do you do with this information?
You have to put the work that you learned in the workshop.
Exactly. And a lot of organizations didn't have the infrastructure in place to do that. Or they had brought in people to be a trainer, but trainers and strategists are two different things. Mm. So that was another area that stood out to me and actually was one of the motivators for me to write my book too, was because I was one of those people delivering the workshops, even doing culture assessments, providing strategies, but then the organizations are still just like, like, now, what do I do with this? And specifically in the context of design, I really wanted us to see, what does our process look like when we incorporate these concepts? And I wanted to switch it so that we weren't just talking about concepts with no context, but I was talking about it in the context of what we already have in common as designers. Yeah. Because then everyone has some base level understanding of that. And then we can kind of connect the dots in that similar context. And even from talks that I've given, from talking to people after they've read the book, it resonates differently. These concepts resonate differently when they can say, oh, what you meant was, this is how this conversation could sound, or these are the steps that we could add to our process to reach these outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of the focus up to now has been about a lot of talk.
Yeah.
People historically excluded backgrounds want outcomes.
Yeah.
Like the talk was like the moment, like, okay, maybe you're getting it. Yes, maybe you're getting it. But now I want to see something different in my life. Like
Exactly.
I want to see something different about the way I experience the world as a result of your understanding. Yeah. So that's what my focus is.
Thrive in Design is more than just a podcast. We are a design and innovation consultancy that focuses on helping interior product companies increase their brand awareness and revenue. We do this by truly understanding a designer's experience with your brand. We need to know what they experience from the time they learn about your brand, through the specification process, through that product being shipped out to the job site. Understanding pain points in that experience is crucial in increasing your brand awareness and revenue. So whether you need to revamp your branding, marketing, or sales strategy, or the complete customer journey, we are here to help your company thrive. Head to thriveindesign.co/contact and let's get the conversation going about how we can help your interior product company. I actually remember when your book came out. Like, this is before we met. I remember seeing it and I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be game changing in the industry. And I sent it to all of my friends. I was like, you have to check this out. So fast forward a little over a year later and we met at NeoCon and I was like, oh my God, you're Jessica. So yeah, full circle. So I'm so excited for the work that you're doing. So let's talk a little bit more about the book and the outcomes that people are able to like move towards with the action that you want them to take. And this is really important because you just said that this is in the context of something versus when I see a lot of other DEI consultants and strategists are focusing on like the broader scheme of DEI, how it can be really applies to any organization. But I love that you're specifically focusing on the design process, and that could be any type of design. So tell us a little bit more about any framework that you have and how that is really tied to an outcome that you hope for design-driven brands to have.
Yeah, so all of that whole rationale was behind the development of what I call the Design for Identity Blueprint. So when I started thinking about, like we're talking about context, connecting dots, I wanted to think about what all this sounds like in the context of the process that we already know. And I wanted to do that. I wanted to look at another iteration of the process we're already familiar with, because incorporating these concepts doesn't mean we have to start from scratch. It doesn't mean we completely obliterate everything in every process we've ever had. It just means we need to be more deliberate in the process that we already know. So I really started looking at the phases of a typical design process and identifying at what points we need to engage with our customers to inquire about their identities, not just, at the very beginning and not just at the very end, but throughout the process, to make sure that we are validating how we're interpreting what they share with us. If we are focusing on the right things, if we are prioritizing the right signifiers of their identity, then what we see is the ultimate end product. So that's important. Then it's also important for us as a design team to be asking ourselves questions along the way to make sure that we don't lose sight of identity in the process, and that we're also being very honest with ourselves about the lack of diversity in most of our teams, and making sure that because of that, we're not leaning on our narrow views or opinions of people and information that we're receiving, that we are maybe asking beyond the confines of our teams to get other perspectives that might be helpful, that we're even stopping at moments to even potentially even ask customers, are there resources you would recommend for us to learn about? Because we also don't want to put the burden on them for them to tell us, explain your whole existence to me. So it's really about identifying, as I said, deliberate points throughout the design process to ask pointed questions of the customers, pointed questions among ourselves, to make sure that identity doesn't become an afterthought, and that we are also not just designing based on our own narrow view of what
Yeah.
anybody's identity is.
Yeah. And that's really similar or rooted in design thinking too, right? Having a human-centered approach. And this is just even further having literally an inclusive human-centered approach to think about who you're designing for. And I can see that being relevant in designing spaces, designing products, designing marketing, collateral, honestly, just anything that any touch point that you're designing that is definitely relevant.
And even you mentioned design thinking and marketing. And those are two areas in particular where I think we need to be super deliberate, not only about being human-centered, but looking at how human-centered we're being. Because I also have a background in design thinking that has gotten me exposure to product design, UI, UX design, many of those spaces where they kind of pat themselves on the back and say, oh, we do this all the time. We are all about customer engagement. But it's not just that you do customer engagement, it is how you do customer engagement and what that sounds like. That's another part of like the behaviors that we need to evaluate, because you can go into an environment all day and say, yeah, we created this opportunity to have a conversation, but how safe did you make this space? How deliberate were you in actually gathering what was really important to the audience, as opposed to the things that you didn't edit out because it sounded too strange or it didn't make sense or it wasn't acceptable in your mind. And then in marketing, we develop avatars, we develop these personas, but those can also be very limiting based on our own experience or our assessment of what fits this profile. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the fact that you do things, it's the awareness of how you're doing it and making sure that you're bringing in more authentic perspectives into that process too.
Yeah. And a key word that you just said too was awareness. Awareness in the different things that you're doing, really having empathy with the people that you're designing for. So let's touch on that real quick because awareness, how do people even gain it? Like, how do people realize that they're not aware? How do they become more aware? Like, give us all the tea on that.
You know what? I think honestly, it's about just having a moment where you realize I do not know everything about everyone.
Yeah.
And just accepting that. And it's interesting because I think as designers, we think we have to know everything to design well for a particular group, client, whatever. And that's not true. In my mind, you have to be willing to learn to be an excellent designer. You have to be willing to listen to be an excellent designer, because ultimately we're the experts on design, but our customers are the experts on themselves. So together, our expertise creates great things. And I think it's a little bit about shedding the ego that we have to know everything and we do know everything. We are the only experts in the room.
Right.
And to be willing to go into every project, every client and customer engagement with this curiosity, because that's what's going to help us create something that is actually impactful. So there has to be at least that willingness to say, I'm okay not getting all of it, because I do know the design part, but I can learn the other pieces of it. And if you also create this connection and this relationship in the way that is going to be most effective, what you'll find is your customers will freely give you the information that will empower you to deliver the best possible product for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it can't be the best possible product just in your estimation.
Exactly. And you said something key there. You are not the only expert in the room, meaning the designer is not the only expert, which even makes me think about design school in general, right? I studied interior design in undergrad, and just thinking about all the things they didn't teach us. You really just get a baseline understanding of the design process, how to develop a design concept, materiality, lighting, the different segments you can design for, right? You have a baseline understanding. But at least for me, I don't even think we did real projects for real people. And now that I'm thinking about it, it was all like these scenarios. We didn't talk to anyone.
Exactly. Right? You're given a program and you're
like,
go do your
for
thing. Exactly, which is completely not reality. And it's so funny you mentioned this because I actually had a chance to teach a course on my book last fall. And I was teaching undergrad interior design students. And it was really interesting because with my design thinking background, one of our activities was actually a design sprint about how to teach a class about being inclusive in design. And I took one of their ideas and made it the final project, which was I paired the students up so that they were designing for each other. They had to design each other's dream space.
I love that.
And part of the process was to actually do the consultation, which is something we don't get to do with students.
Yeah.
And of course, the added spin on that was you had to explore identity with your client and then also incorporate that into your presentation. How did you interpret what they shared with you into an actual physical space? And they were actually excited about that because they were like, I never get, like I said, we get a program. Like I'm usually designing for this fictitious person or this fictitious community. And I never get to even practice asking any questions. And I had them do the consultations in the room. So if they got stuck, they could just, how do I address this? How do I say that? But it was good experience because that's what this job is. You're never just behind a computer all the time.
Yeah.
And that's really, and when you especially look at residential design, because that was one of the studios I flashed back to when I was writing my book, it's the most intimate settings you will ever work on with a stranger, right?
Exactly.
And we are never taught to address anything about what is personally meaningful to them when it comes to their identity, which is just, it doesn't even make sense when you really think about it. Like I said, that's the most, if you're going to be yourself anywhere, it is your home.
Exactly.
And we never get to so many nuances of what will make our space just for us. And even thinking, we never even ask about sacred spaces, any kind of, practices tied to your belief system. We don't learn how to design for multi-generational households because the standard is mom, dad, the two kids, and the dog. So there's just so many aspects of people's lived experiences that we just never even learn to consider.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I honestly didn't even have that connection that we never designed for real people until this very moment. That is absurd. So all of these thousands of designers are graduating from whatever design program, architecture, design, interior design, industrial design, graphic design, all the things without ever having talked to a real person to design for. And that is like core of why this is so important.
One of the dangers of that is then those people are also put in front of a community, in front of a school with no background on how to engage and create a safe space and how to create this environment where people who are vulnerable themselves, because they're having to explain who they are to you, you're not learning how to frame that conversation. You're also not learning how to listen, so you walk away with something that's really valuable. So there's a lot of implications of not paying attention to that.
So really it's like a two-part thing. All of the schools that are educating our designers needs to be incorporating this into the curriculum, these principles. And then for the people who are already out of school, like me, who just realized that we did not design for real people, we need the training, the expertise, the workshops, and the hands-on steps to actually put things in action each and every day. So for those who are listening, if they are looking to make a change, integrate DEIB into their workplace culture or how they are designing, whatever it is they're designing, where should they actually start?
Well, I think, honestly, the book is a great place to start. So checking out Design for Identity, it is really meant to be something that you can potentially experience by yourself, but there are also QR codes to downloadable discussion guides at the end of each chapter, which can really help because, as I mentioned in my philosophy around learning around these topics, having space to process is really important. So if you can even create space to discuss the concepts in the book, it really starts getting your wheels turning in a different way. It helps open your mind to different perspectives and possibilities. And that's where that awareness starts coming in that we were talking about. So the book is really meant to expand awareness, and then it actually ends with a chapter where you develop your own kind of action plan for your next steps. And that's really meant to be an opportunity for reflection. But I did want to take it a step further after that, and I developed a digital workbook that really helps kind of start putting that action plan into place and really start looking at the behaviors and the actual practices that signify, okay, I got that. Now, what can I do differently in a myriad of ways in how I'm showing up as a designer? So I think that first part is really key, though, in really getting the understanding of why this is even important in design and what it's within our control as individuals, but with much more impact if we could do it at the team and firm levels to really bring about change and bring about equitable outcomes and experiences.
Yeah, awesome. I love that. And just to wrap it up, I know that some organizations, especially those product companies that are listening that I mentioned, sometimes they're all about their bottom line, their ROI. They need to see how we're measuring this. Can these efforts be measured, and how so? If so,
they can be measured. They can be measured. For that particular group you just spoke to, I would say read chapter 1 because it is all about why any kind of design business needs to be thinking about this. But there are many ways that this can be measured, and it depends on what way you're looking at it. So in the internal culture of an organization, from that standpoint, some organizations will monitor their demographics. They'll look at their retention and their recruiting rates for different identities, people of different demographic backgrounds. They'll make an assessment of leadership within their organizations. Where is their diversity? Where is diversity lacking? Is it at certain levels? Is it within certain departments? Things like that. So from a very elementary standpoint, that's where you can really just start assessing what is the makeup of our organization. And then you can also, I think it's really important to extrapolate and look at where you are in the context of your whole industry. And I think having that bigger frame of reference is important too, because you also might have some peers who are doing real well at this that you need to have an awareness of. And then you can also look at things like, from a business standpoint, what are you supporting minority and women-owned small businesses? Are you being intentional about developing those kinds of relationships and not just doing it to check the box and say we did it, but to actually add value to the organizations that you're partnering with and asking them literally the question, how can we add value? Not going in with this idea that, oh, I have it all figured out and I'll do this for them. Like you're not doing them a favor. They're another business. So there are things like that. And internally, some organizations have like employee engagement surveys to get a gauge on how much people feel like they belong, how much of a place they feel they have in their organization. That can be a really key kind of insight. And to me, though, I would say, honestly, one of the biggest ways that I gauge whether this is working or not is the level of candor and how frequently we're having real honest conversations about identity that we never had before. To me, like that's one of the biggest indicators that it's becoming part of the culture. It's becoming a norm, not to say you're going to solve everything in 6 months, a year, or anything like that, but you're never going to make progress on something you never talk about. Mm-hmm. So if it is becoming a more regular thing across levels in different places, then I think that should be a sign to you that, okay, we're making some progress because people feel safe enough to even explore it. So there's, it's a whole range of ways.
I love that. Awesome. Well, Jessica, this has been such a good episode. You shared so much information. I even had an aha moment. And I hope that those that are listening really take this seriously, take this conversation seriously, and don't give up on their DEIB efforts. Or if they haven't started yet, that they feel an inclination to pick up your book as a first option, and that will be linked in the show notes, and then to take action after that. If my listeners want to connect with you and learn more about the work that you're doing, where can they find you online?
Sure. You can go to jessicabantom.com. There's information there about the book, about the digital workbook, and also, that's where you can get in touch with me directly if you'd even like to have more conversations about potentially having support and going through this experience. You can also follow me on Instagram at Jessica Bantom. And I'm also pretty regular visitor to LinkedIn. So if you'd like to connect there, just look up Jessica Bantom, and I'd be glad to connect and have a chat.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. This has been amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this week on Thrive in Design. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Thrive in Design. And for more strategies on how your product company can innovate in the interior design industry, head to training.thriveindesign.co. As always, subscribe to the show to catch every new episode and leave us a review so we can continue to create captivating content. See you next week.